All right, let's talk about literary theory. I know, the term itself can sound a little scary, right? Kind of makes you think of these super dense philosophical books that have nothing to do with just enjoying a story. But what if I told you it's not that at all? What if it's really just a set of amazing tools that help us understand not just books, but the way we make sense of, well, everything? So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to pull back the curtain and give you a clear map to some of the biggest ideas in literary theory. You know, for the longest time, reading was a pretty comfortable, straightforward thing. The main idea was that great art, a classic book or a poem, held some kind of stable, universal meaning. It was seen as this timeless container of truth about being human, and that truth was something anyone, anywhere could tap into in the exact same way. And then things started to get complicated. People began asking some pretty radical questions, like, what if the meaning of a story isn't universal at all? What if it totally depends on who's reading it and when they're reading it and what kind of world it was born into? This is the fundamental challenge of literary theory. It takes reading from this quiet, cozy consensus and turns it into this lively, messy, and fascinating debate. And we're not talking about a small adjustment here. The sources call it a seismic change for a reason. The 20th century basically just opened the floodgates to a whole wave of competing theories, and every single one offered a brand new, totally revolutionary way to think about what a text is and what it does. So how in the world do we keep all this straight? Well, we're going to use a really simple map as our guide. Just think of any act of communication. You've got the person sending the message itself, the person receiving it, and the world they're all living in. The whole history of modern theory is basically the story of a spotlight moving from one of these points to the next. Okay, so let's start with the very first big shift. This is where critics decided to just tune out all the noise, the history, the author's biography, all of it, and focus on one thing and one thing only. And you can see it right here on our map. Bam! The spotlight moves directly onto the message. For these critics, everything else was just a distraction. The author's intent? Irrelevant. The reader's feelings? Didn't matter. The only thing that mattered were the words on the page. This whole approach got the name New Criticism. And for the new critics, a great poem was like a well-wrought urn. Think about it. A perfect, self-contained object. You wouldn't ask a beautiful vase what its creator was thinking, right? Or what the politics were like when it was made? No. You study its shape, its patterns, its internal harmony. You look at how it takes all these messy things like irony and paradox and somehow resolves them perfectly within itself. This famous line from the poet Archibald MacLeish just nails it. It perfectly captures that new critical vibe. The point wasn't to boil a poem down to a simple meaning or a moral. The point was to appreciate the thing itself for what it is, this incredibly complex, beautiful object that exists on its own terms. At the same time, over in Europe, a similar movement was brewing, but with a slightly different flavor: Russian formalism. These guys were even more methodical. They wanted to create a science of literature, and their coolest, most powerful idea was something called defamiliarization. The logic is simple. Everyday life makes us numb. We stop seeing the things that are right in front of us. Art's job is to smack us out of that routine by describing ordinary things in a strange new way, forcing us to actually see them again. But you can only keep the real world locked out for so long, right? The next big wave of theorists basically kicked the doors wide open and let all of it, history, politics, power, come rushing right back in. And it completely changed the kinds of questions people were asking. And this slide just lays out the shift so brilliantly. I mean, look at the difference. The new critic sees a beautiful, unified text and asks, how does it create this wonderful harmony? But the Marxist critic looks at that exact same harmony and asks a totally different, much sharper question. Okay, that's nice, but who benefits from this feeling of order? Whose power and whose interest does this so-called harmony actually serve? All of a sudden, that perfect urn is a political battlefield. So let's go back to our map. You can see the spotlight has just swung dramatically. It's now shining brightly on the context, that whole social, economic, and political world that the text lives in. This is the home of Marxist and feminist criticism. And their shared, really radical insight is this: no text is innocent. They argue that every story, every poem, is a product of its time and place. It's soaked in the power structures of its society, whether that's about class struggle or patriarchy or the legacy of colonialism. Okay, so we've looked at the text itself and we've looked at the world around it. But what about the one piece we've been missing? What about the person actually doing the reading? Yeah, the next big move in theory puts the reader, puts you smack dab in the center of it all. So our spotlight moves one more time, and this time it lands squarely on the addressee, the reader. The idea here is pretty profound. A book just sitting on a shelf doesn't really have any meaning, does it? It's just ink and paper. Meaning only sparks into life in the moment that someone actually opens it and starts to read. And this is reader response theory. It argues that meaning isn't a thing you dig out of a page. It's an event that happens in the act of reading. A text is never complete. It's full of gaps or blanks that you, the reader, have to fill in with your own experiences, your own imagination. You're not just a passive consumer of the story. You are an active co-creator. You bring it to life. All right, get ready. We're about to take the most radical and maybe the most mind-bending turn yet. What if the issue isn't just about who's writing or what the text says or who's reading? What if the problem is with language itself? Welcome to the world of post-structuralism. Its core, game-changing idea is that language is fundamentally unstable. I mean, think about it. When you look up a word in a dictionary, what do you find? You just find more words. Meaning is never fully there in any single word. It's always being pushed down the line, deferred, constantly pointing to other words in this huge, slippery chain. And this is the key takeaway, something the critic Roland Barthes put so well. If language is just this big web of existing signs, then there's no such thing as a truly original expression. A writer isn't some genius creating a masterpiece out of thin air. They're more like a DJ, digging through the crates of this massive dictionary of culture and language that already exists, and mixing those bits and pieces into something new. So the main tool for post-structuralism is called deconstruction, which I know sounds super complicated, but is actually a pretty simple three-step move. First, it finds a hidden power imbalance in a text, like the way Western culture has always valued speech as more authentic than writing. Second, just to see what happens, it flips that hierarchy on its head to expose the bias. But then, in This Is the Killer move, it shows that neither side is pure or stable. Neither one can exist without the other, and that dismantles the whole opposition. So, wow. After all of that, after all these intellectual wars and revolutions, where are we now? Well, the age of theory with a capital T, where one big idea was supposed to explain everything, that's pretty much over. What we have now is something way more interesting. So our whole journey took us from staring just at the text to looking at the world, then to the reader, and finally, to questioning the very nature of language. But here's the thing. Each new step didn't cancel out the last one. It just added another tool to the box. A critic today doesn't have to swear allegiance to one school. They have this entire, versatile toolkit, and they can use any of those tools to ask better, sharper questions. And this right here is why any of this matters. This quote just gets right to the heart of it. Understanding theory is not some dry academic game. It's a form of power. Being able to look at an argument or a news story or even an advertisement and see the hidden assumptions behind it, to theorize your own practice, that means you can be an active, critical participant in the world, not just a passive consumer. So in the end, that's what theory really is. It doesn't give you a neat little set of answers. It gives you new eyes. It gives you different lenses to see the world in ways that are richer and deeper and more critical. It hands you a toolkit for thinking. So the only question left, the one I'll leave you with, is this. What are you going to build with them?